good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the third of our 4 Cadbury Lectures 2016. It's a special pleasure for me to chair today. My name is Charlotte Hempel, and it's International Women's Day. So we have already tweeted how prominent women are tonight. And the series, as you may all recall, is Religion in Public Life, Leveling the Ground. And it's taking sort of an incremental twist, started locally in Lecture 1. It moved last week to thinking about the metropolis and to what extent London is a very special place, and also with a great deal of nuance, emphasizing different parts of London, like the East End and the changes that have occurred there, like the buildings that are iconic that we looked at, and in the way we looked at Fleet Street and the journalistic take on religion that did not impress our speaker, Grace, very much. And today we're moving to a national picture with a subtitle, Whose Feathers Are Ruffled? And I've just remembered in all the excitement about International Women's Day that I forgot to introduce Grace properly. So I just want to go back and mention that Grace is Emeritus Professor of Sociology of Religion at the University of Exeter, where she also studied as an undergraduate, and she then did her PhD at the LSE, and she's had prestigious visiting appointments at Uppsala and in Paris. So a very welcome back to you, Grace, and we look forward to the next installment.
Thank you, Charlotte, very much. Thank you all for the welcome back. And I'm just going to do a very, very quick story so far. I know some of you are coming for all the lectures, which is very, very encouraging for me, but there may be 1 or 2 new faces. And the crucial thing is to appreciate that religion is present in the public sphere in new ways, but to insist that it was once absent and is once nowhere and is now everywhere is somewhat misleading. We need to be a little bit more discerning about it. But the paradox that we're pursuing is that the process of secularization is undoubtedly continuing. It's not as if we have, as it were, stopped being secular, but that religion is growing in public debate. There's a growing prominence of the topic in public discussion, but this is not an easy situation because the process of secularization has meant that we're losing the vocabulary, tools and concepts that we require to have a constructive conversation about faith. So what emerges is this rather ill-informed and ill-mannered debate about issues of extreme importance to the democratic future of our country. And that's what I've tried to explore in these lectures. And as Charlotte said, we looked at the local, and we look at the local and then the metropolitan, and now we are on to national conversation or national debates. And my subtitle in this is Whose Feathers Are Ruffled when we talk about religion in public life? We will discover. And I'm working on 2 longish stories. The first is the story of Faith in the City and its aftermath. Faith in the City is the report of the Archbishop of Canterbury's Commission on Urban Priority Areas. After this was published, there was an immediate media storm, generating much higher than expected sales, and this document had profound and far-reaching impact. Now, my second story is the story of Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, very controversial, but welcomed initially with positive reviews. The 1988 Booker Prize finalist, a 1998 Whitbread Award for the Novel of the Year, but a very difficult controversy ensues. There's the images of the two covers. I have an attachment to Faith in the City because my very first book, which was called Inner City God, I always think of that when I go on a train. It's like Intercity God, but it's Inner City God. And it was about the nature of belief in the inner city, published in 1987, and it was initially written as a background study to Faith in the City. It was based on my experience of Liverpool, where I was living at the time, and it's from that environment and from that thinking and reflection and writing that the phrase believing without belonging came. I became very aware in the urban areas of Liverpool, which is an unusual city, it's an atypical city, that even if churches were finding life hard and even if church going was patchy, levels of belief were high. It is, of course, skewed by the fact that about 40% of people who live in Liverpool are Catholic. It's almost up to half. And it was a very distinctive profile. Just emerging at this time out of a sectarian past. It was the years of David Shepherd and Archbishop Derek Warlock, a very unique partnership, which I was very privileged to be part of. They were good years for me. And then in 2006, that's 20 years later, I took part in an Institute for Contemporary British History witness seminar, which was organised by Hugh, who is here. Is that right? Yes, it was. You chaired it. Well, you were very much part of it. And this was an interesting retrospect. 20 years on, these witness seminars are a form of oral history when people who took part in the initial debate come back some years on and, as it were, relive what happened. It was slightly sobering to think you were already part of history. I mean, I thought the 1980s and all the things that happened in Liverpool and Militant and all that kind of thing just happened. Well, they're not now, they're history. But I remember it very well, and I remember that event in London. And then go on more or less to now, and I found this very interesting. In January 2016, the cabinet papers referring to Faith in the City are released under the 30 years rule. So we, as it were, get to hear or get to see what they really said about it. Well, they were not complimentary, as you could imagine. The political comment is very predictable. Faith in the City was markedly hostile to government policy, Thatcher government policy. The accusations go in both directions. It is deemed to be pure Marxist theology. And Brian Griffiths, very close to the Prime Minister at the time, writes thus: its own approach is collectivist, determinist, and Keynesian. The inner city problems will be solved through bigger governments. It all sounds a wee bit dated now, but that's how it was, as it were, seen by the cabinet. All that is now publicly available. I can't say that I dug in the archive to find this leading article because the Church Times very conveniently republished it. And I found this very, very interesting because they go back to what they said in 1985 and write thus: what the Commission has to say, what they have to say, may often seem disturbing to a church which is predominantly middle class, still substantially rural, and almost entirely white. In 1985, yeah, well, I think they were already wrong then, and I think they're even more wrong now. Either they were seriously misled at the time, or an awful lot has changed, because a lot of the work that we did last week was pointing out that it is now the rural church, of course, which is having a much harder time than many urban situations, and more than half of the people worshipping in London in Christian churches are not white. So, I mean, is this a change in reality or a change in perception? my hunch is it's both. But I would contend still, there is still widespread concern about the absence of ethnic minorities at more senior levels in the church. So a lot of people who are not of a white background are present in the pews, but not necessarily in positions of leadership, and that remains a concern. But much has changed, and I think our outlook have changed too. Do you know this book? This is Eliza Filby. I've heard Eliza lecture. She's very engaging. And she starts by saying, I was born in the 1980s. Well, that was a bit of a, I mean, that's why for Eliza, it is history. Because her generation, this is, she thinks, or it is very much a retrospect. This is a very lively book. It is a measured analysis of the changing relationship between the Anglican Church and the state, the bishops, and the Thatcher government. I do commend it to you. Published last year. But pushing a little bit harder on what the 1980s were about, it's then that you find a shift to the right in the Conservative Party and a commitment to the market as the key to economic growth. That's going to be a theme that we'll return to. And we see also the collapse of the Labour Party as effective opposition. Well, that sounds rather too familiar to me now. I find the current situation very problematic because we do not have an effective opposition. And I think that is a very dangerous situation in politics. But this was the 1980s, really the hegemony of Mrs. Thatcher, her decade, if you like, and a marked shift in the nature of conservatism. This opens up because there is no political opposition, and I remember remarking on that in the history seminar that we did in London. This opens up a potentially very dangerous void because who and on what authority could speak on behalf of those caught at the sharp end of these economic and social transformations? There are a whole mass of people who are, as it were, victims of sharp economic and social change, whether or not you argue that's necessary, and who are very exposed, and there is nobody, as it were, to speak for them. Into this situation step the churches quite clearly. And what you see here, is it still possible for this to happen? Or was this a kind of moment where this is one of the last moments when this can happen? I think that's quite an interesting question to ask, is whether precisely this is still possible. Because what you see is the capacities of an established church, a parish church, the comprehensive church, the church that covers the whole land, the capacities of that church to defend those parts of society. We used at the time the phrase urban priority areas, which were perceived as victims of economic change. And in those UPAs were disproportionate numbers of newly arrived, but still, this is the crucial point, still largely perceived as ethnic minorities, not as religious minorities. In this situation, support for Faith in the City comes from the left, who encouraged any initiative that discomforted the free marketeers. I don't think the people on the left were particularly committed to Anglican values or Anglican theology, but it was quite good to see them, as it were, exposing the political ideas of the right, which neither group, secular or religious, were particularly enamoured, of which they were particularly enamoured. And One Nation Tories are caught in between. This is a marked shift, of course, in the Conservative Party. I'm not absolutely sure that it works out in as it were, the tensions we see in the current Conservative Party, which of course is very split, but over a rather different issue and conceptualized differently. In that respect, time has changed. And so, in reacting to religious controversy and whose feathers are ruffled, in the 1980s, the discussion was largely about socio-economic issues and found its focus in the negative consequences of an over-rigorous application of monetarist policies. The attack was directed at the New Right, some of whom reacted sharply to what was considered an unwarranted intrusion by churches and church people into political affairs. Those on the political left, though largely sidelined from political activity, were unlikely to object. There is, of course, before I leave this particular bit of what I want to say, there is, of course, a debate that we could have about faith in the city itself. It was a very remarkable document, but I think it, running right through it, of course, there is a tension between a really radical critique of society and between what I would call an ameliorist approach, that you do what you can to improve the lot of people living in a particular place. And I think we saw some of that echo when we were talking about even very local movements who were small initiatives who were providing support, the food banks and job clubs and the debt people as well. And we're always asking the same question: are we, by, as it were, going down that route, are the churches doing the work of the government? And are they therefore less able to as it were, be prophetic about the situation and, as it were, call the government to account? All I really want to remark on is this is hardly new. This was really very, very central to the whole debate around faith in the city. And you feel it on every page. It's unresolved in the report as to whether the church does what it can, or whether you, for example, the obvious thing is it's a wet night, there are a lot of homeless people. Do you open your church hall, give them a dry place to sleep, or do you bang on the town hall and say, do something about this? And I think we're still in that dilemma, and my real comment about that is you do both. It's very easy to end up in such perplexity that you do nothing. So the best is to do both. That one does not, as it were, preclude the other. The date and the quote here is from the book. So now I'm going on to the second controversy, which starts just a little bit later. This is not the Satanic Verses itself. This is Paul Weller's book. I don't know whether you know Paul in Derby. He's not very far away from you. And in 2009, that's the 20-year anniversary, he publishes the book called A Mirror for Our Times, which is a wonderful account of the various stages of the debate. I found it very enlightening. And Bhikkhu Parekh comes up with the phrase of a mirror for our times, because it becomes, I think the Rushdie controversy becomes a real catalyst. It is the lens through which to see the place of religion in British society. All sorts of things happen, and this is 4 years or something just after Faith in the City, and a great deal changes. We'll just do the bare bones of the story. This is not a detailed account. If you want a chronological account, Paul Weller does give a wonderful, simply, it's not day by day, but it's a very accurate timeline, which is a very useful thing to have, and it's at the beginning of the book. The book is first published in 1988. The novel was pretty soon deemed blasphemous by the Muslim community, whose initial and I think very understandable outrage eventually included public book burnings, partly because nobody took any notice of, as it were, reasonable attempts to say, could we discuss this? And then we get to a very critical moment in February 1989, when the Ayatollah proclaimed a fatwa declaring the author, Salman Rushdie, guilty of blasphemy, and he is forced into hiding. Again, I can remember this, and many of you can too, I'm sure. But the turn of events is very unexpected in a way, or unpredictable, because in December 1990, Salman Rushdie himself publicly embraces Islam, and this becomes a key moment in a chain of events, but one that was not reciprocated by the religious authorities in Iran, who reaffirmed the fatwa. And then the whole thing begins to escalate. Lives were lost in violent encounters outside Britain, including the stabbing to death of the translator of the Japanese edition. In short, and it is very much in short, this is an episode that appeared to violate almost every assumption of a modern, liberal, and supposedly tolerant society. It's the intractability of the underlying issues that we need to look at. The relative merits of two freedoms, the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech. Remember, the freedom of religion is, if you look at any set of articles which include Article 9 in the European Convention of Human Rights, it's always divided into two halves. We have absolute freedom of belief. You do not have absolute freedom to express that. That's always a limited freedom. So, you know, this issue of freedom of religion as opposed to freedom of speech, can I say what I like regardless of the offense it gives, is a very difficult, as it were, set of issues to think through. It's not easy. And this is where you begin to realize that our concepts, tools, vocabularies, imagination, metaphors are inadequate for the task. This is what I meant by saying that we, you know, our society is being drained of the resources that we need to engage what are not straightforward issues. Now, the second underlying issue that emerges extremely clearly is that tolerance is a social construction. Tolerance is not straightforward, because this is an old question, it's an old political question. To what extent can a democracy tolerate the undemocratic? And in this particular stream of events, the real exposing point is that secular liberals required Muslims to be tolerant of a book that they found offensive, but they were refusing to be tolerant of Rushdie when he declared himself to be a Muslim. They were outraged. And you know, you can see that they're wanting some kinds of tolerance and not other kinds of tolerance. You know, we can all be tolerant of the things we like. The challenge is to be tolerant of things we find difficult, and even things which challenge our values. And I still think this is an unresolved debate. But the great British public was bewildered, because they were working on a completely different set of issues, which is live and let live. And if you don't like a book or a film or a play, don't watch it, don't read it. and that's the end of it. And that is the really critical thing, is that large numbers of British people have a real difficulty in, as it were, putting themselves in the shoes of a minority that is desperately hurt by something. And you know, how can you get people to be more imaginative about, if I did this, then somebody might feel very upset by it. And have we got the imagination to do this? And you'll see in a minute that the same story repeats itself again and again. I do think that the basis of a truly tolerant and pluralist society remains elusive. And we keep on colliding with this issue. But before I show you some of the follow-up events, I think why I wanted to put these two stories together is because this is the moment when ethnicity as a category cedes the place to religion. And I think this is a shift of particular importance for the Muslim community in this country, who were instinctively drawn together at this point. But if you, as it were, go to the 2001 census, where we have no question on religion, but we have a question on ethnicity or even nationality, some communities in this country come out, as it were, intact, like the Jewish community and the Sikh community will still be visible, but the Muslim community is fragmented and dispersed amongst many, many different categories. And it's only later, in the 2001 census, I'm sorry, the first one was 1991. It's only in the 2001 census that we get the question on religion, which is emerging precisely because of these issues, to see, you know, where are the categories that we need to think in. And so we get a very different kind of controversy, which concerns the competing rights of secular and religious constituencies, recognizing that the latter are not only much more varied, but are much more ready to press their claims in public as well as private life. So the shift is moving from ethnic and racial towards a much more developed recognition, or perhaps grudging recognition, of religion as a category in public life. And then the ruffled feathers are found in a different place. Because this time they're found amongst increasingly self-conscious secularists, often, but no means by only, on the political left. And here you find a profound irony, because those whose political predilections led them to defend minority groups disadvantaged by racial or ethnic factors are far less likely to defend the religious aspirations of the self-same people. The minority is the same, the issues are different, and so the support from certain categories of our society melts away. Now, I could put this in, as it were, more academic language, because I could say that social science, which is my discipline, sociology, political science, and all the disciplines that are around those terms, don't deal well with religion. They were much, much more comfortable with class, gender, ethnicity, race, and as soon as religion enters the fray, it's much more difficult because, of course, each of these disciplines, and we'll pursue this point in the last lecture, each of these disciplines is resting on a very secular political philosophy of science, which comes out of the European Enlightenment. It comes out of the French Enlightenment. It's very much based on rationalism, on a secular philosophy of science, and as soon as you begin to take religion seriously, you are almost beginning, or you are beginning, to cut off the branch on which you are sitting. And this is not a very comfortable place to be. So we see it amongst, as it were, political analysts, commentators on society, in journalism, but you also see it in academic debate. And I think this is still continuing, and some disciplines are, as it were, moving faster than others. International relations is moving much faster and political theory is beginning to move, political science is beginning to move. Sociology is quite stubbornly not in many ways. And much of the debate about religion has moved sideways into anthropology. And you're finding it in a different place. And so I think you've got an interesting shift in the academic debate, as well as, or an interesting challenge to the academic debate, as well as to immediate political controversy. I wouldn't like to say, though, that anti-religious sentiments are confined to the political left when it comes to the recently arrived. I don't know whether you know Abby Day's work on nominal religion, nominal Christianity, and she has three categories in this, but one of them is to do with the ethnic Christian. And she exposes quite a potentially dangerous illusion of Christian and Englishness. And I am wondering whether this is going to, as it were, fuel some of the debate about the European referendum. Time will tell, because in the European referendum, of course, you can move in both directions, because you can see a religious argument for the Church of England and England, if you like, and Brexit, but you can also see a strong argument which draws Europe and the different spiritual families of Europe together, and to see the building of Europe as quite closely related, and very closely related, to the evolution of ecumenism in the late 20th century, as the bits of Christendom come back together. And in the 1990s, I can remember talking and writing about this. And just as an aside, there are some rather interesting parallels in France. You can see very different interpretations of laïcité, which is their secularism, on the French left or in the French left, which traditionally stood against a right which was pro-Catholic. But in these different interpretations of laïcité, you see both, as it were, the secular, laïque, as the level playing field, the place where multiculturalism can flourish. But there's also a much harder, sharper laïcité, which is very excluding of religion in the public sphere. And this can be quite an very sharply anti-religious debate. I've read some very interesting things recently indicating that the Front National is beginning to discover laïcité, turning, as it were, this against Islam. So instead of seeing the debate between laïque and catholique, and laïque and the Catholic Church, very much aligned with the right in French, the Front National, which is very right, is turning this argument into a sort of nationalist argument against Islam. And it's not a particularly attractive way of behaving. But what I want to show you now is that these unresolved issues that in a way I've exposed in British society, particularly the real standoff between freedom of religion and freedom of speech. The Rushdie controversy was simply an early example which repeated itself all over Europe. And so you get a string of events which start at the end of 1990 really, because in the early days of the Rushdie controversy, and I remember doing this and writing about it, the French were very, as it were, bewildered by this discussion of blasphemy. You know, they thought that was something that was a historical, that didn't happen in the late 20th, never mind the 21st century, and were very sort of contemptuous of the British debate. In the meantime, of course, they were having their own troubles over the Affaire du Foulard, because the problem for France was the visibility in public sphere of Muslim dress. And this effectively is continuing. I mean, there's a lull every now and again, but the recent difficulties in France, of course, have been concerned with full covering, which is banned in public places in France and in Belgium. And you know, this, it's not resolved. It keeps coming back again and again. And then, if you remember, in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands are, you know, were at the time always one step ahead of us in terms of liberal values and embracing, as it were, same-sex marriage. They were one of the first, and then all the soft issues and the soft drugs and all the rest of it. They construct themselves very much as a liberal society, and they were really devastated when you know, two murders take place. The first is Pim Fortuyn. I'm not quite sure how the Dutch say this. Fortuyn, I think it is. In 2002, and then Theo van Gogh, which was a much more brutal affair, in 2004, and it's exactly the same issue, that he has published a film which is very unpleasant. Had he the right to do it? And then all the things that follow, and the Dutch bewilderment, of course, because the person who perpetrated that murder was raised in the Netherlands. The individual was Moroccan, but hadn't come from outside, had been raised in the Netherlands. And so the Dutch do a kind of move forward in a very, I don't think Dutch people think this, but in a very strange way, because they try very hard to protect their liberal values, but they do this by excluding anybody who doesn't share them. And so we're left with this paradox of whether you can you can defend liberalism by being illiberal. And it's questionable, most certainly questionable. And then, of course, we move on to the Danish cartoons. And again, it's exactly the same. Is it right or not right to publish this kind of thing? If it is disturbing to significant numbers of people who live in a particular, in your own country. And that debate subsequently spread to Sweden. You hear sort of echoes of that in the neighbouring Nordic countries. And the challenge to the legality of minarets in the Swiss referendum is the same thing. That's not about freedom of speech, but it is about an expression. And you know, can we not just have the building? Do we have to ask the majority of people, is it acceptable? And then I've already mentioned this, the banning of the burqa or niqab in public in some parts of Europe. I did meet Eva Brems, who is a very distinguished scholar of law and religion, who is Belgian. And she was also a member of the Federal Parliament. And she was the only person in the Parliament who voted against the ban. Only one person voted against the ban, and it was Eva. I mean, extraordinary courage. I'm sure I would have ducked it. The reason is that she had done research on women who come into this category, and she knew how they felt. She knew the kind of people they were. And in her conscience, she could not vote for the ban. She's a very interesting person. If you would like to welcome her to Birmingham, I'm sure you would find it interesting. And then in 2015, we get to Charlie Hebdo. Shocking, very shocking, but how should we think about it? Now here, I'm very persuaded by Nigel Biggar, who I think has, as it were, put the point really clearly. This was written exactly a year later, so he has had time to think. It's a retrospect. And since then, of course, the French have had an even worse episode, which is of a slightly different character because it's not about freedom of speech. That was simply the attack in the late autumn, early winter in Paris that we all remember. But Nigel Biggar says this, that and I think I do agree with this very much, that the French satirists did not deserve to die. I don't think any of us in a democracy would say somebody who writes something offensive deserves to die. But they flaunted their legal right to offend and neglected their moral duty not to. In other words, they were legally correct. They had freedom of speech. But they were morally perhaps in a more shaky position. He continues, the right to freedom of speech is precious. It makes possible the seeds of revision, reform, and progress. But simply affirming freedom of speech by means of a legal right is not the end of our responsibility. There remains the moral task of exercising that freedom well or badly. And this, I think, is at root what lies under the Rushdie controversy, was first exposed in the end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s, and we are still struggling with exactly the same issue. It is unresolved. Have we learnt anything? These are distressing examples. Lives have been lost, violence has been perpetrated, people have been ridiculed, people have been made to feel very uncomfortable, people have been exposed. And these are examples of an ill-informed and ill-mannered debate. I mean, my terms are relatively mild, to be honest. It's more than that. About issues of extreme importance to the democratic future of our country. What is to be done? And here, I want to use the last few minutes of my lecture to make a hinge to the next one, because I think one of the things that we have to recall is that we're not, as it were, resolving these issues in our relatively stable and well-functioning democracy. I mean, British democracy is far from perfect, but comparatively speaking, we have a long democratic tradition, and I think, if we can't solve the problem, it's going to be even more difficult anywhere else. But we're playing this out, of course, against the background of a world where very disturbing events are happening, and the two are getting mixed up together. I think that's one reason why it's very difficult to have, as it were, a cool debate in this country. And the increasing visibility in the modern world, I explained to you in the first lecture that we have this European tectonic plate which is becoming increasingly secular, and then we have this global tectonic plate which is not in the least secular, and the two are grating over each other. This is exactly what is happening in all these episodes that I'm trying to explain to you. This is a very uncomfortable position, and the backdrop, the global backdrop, is hardly reassuring for those who are trying to, as it were, forward a democratic solution in this country. And this is where I just want to bring one or two, something a bit striking to your attention. I don't know whether you know this book. Not enough people do. I'll explain a little bit. The book is called Strange Rebels, and it is a retrospect on 1979 as the key date around which the 20th and 21st century pivot. We usually think it's 1989. But this pushes it back to 1979. You can see the cast on the cover, We see Mrs. Thatcher. Ronald Reagan is kind of in the background here. And this is the free market. This is why it picks up the first part of my lecture, which was the story of faith in the city and, as it were, the turn to the right, the market right in this country. You also see Deng Xiaoping, because this is also happening in China. There's a big shift going on in China at the same time. You also see the Ayatollah. Now he, in 1979, left France, went back to Iran, forcing the Shah of Iran to flee. You remember the Shah was a relatively secular Western puppet. And the Ayatollah is motivated by conservative readings of Islam. And you see John Paul II. His election comes at the same time. So you have a whole cluster of things happening in 1979. And what Christian Caryl argues is that they represent the, as it were, emergence of religion and the market, as opposed to secularism and the state. Secularism and the state, or the secular state if you like, is the dominant, as it were, building block of the 20th century. This is how we thought it was going to be. This is modern political science, and this is post-Westphalia and all sorts of things. This was how it was going to be. And then you see, and he doesn't see it at the time, none of us saw it at the time, that's the whole point. If you look back now, think of the Soviet Union in '79. I mean, the economy is beginning to, the command economy is not that secure, and so, you know, the market is beginning to emerge over the command economy, challenged by China, but also challenged religiously by the first war in Afghanistan, which defeats the Soviet army, and John Paul II going to Poland and solidarity. And you remember those incredible scenes when John Paul II goes back to Poland, the whole of the world's press go with him, and the Soviet rulers can do absolutely nothing about it. And you know, you may not have thought that was all that significant, but put these factors together. This is why the book is so interesting, is because it weaves the narrative between what you think, or what I would have thought, were very different, distinct, separate events. But when you look back, they all begin on this date, and you begin to see a new kind of world emerging, which is not easy for those of us trained in 20th century social science to deal with. You know, we need new vocabulary, we need new conceptual tools. And I would describe Christian Caryl's book as upmarket journalism. It is upmarket, rather than scholarship. But I think it is a very provocative book and has made me think a lot about how the world is changing and how we begin to see, as it were, a whole set of categories morphing and demanding a huge, as it were, a hugely imaginative effort for those of us who are trying to understand a whole range of items, but not least the place of religion in the modern world order and in European societies. And that's where I'm going to end today, but the global story we will pick up again on Thursday. So thank you very much once again for your attention.